The crack of a bullwhip echoed through the dusty main street of Hillsborough, New Mexico Territory, in 1879. But it wasn't the sound that caught everyone's attention. It was Willa Jenkins' muffled cry that followed, sending a flock of startled sparrows into the cloudless sky. Willa stumbled backward, clutching her cheek where her husband Frank's harsh words had struck harder than his hand ever could. "I told you never to speak to other men," he hissed, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her face as he gripped her arm, uncaring of the dozen pairs of eyes watching from the boardwalk. "You embarrass me in front of the whole damn town." She hadn't been doing anything wrong. The shopkeeper had simply asked if she needed help carrying her parcels, and she'd politely declined. But to Frank Jenkins, even that small courtesy was a betrayal. "Please, Frank," she whispered. "People are watching." "Let them watch," he growled, tightening his grip on her arm until she knew it would bruise just another mark to hide beneath her long sleeves. "Maybe they'll learn how a man keeps his house in order." Willa noticed a tall figure approaching them from the direction of the livery stable. The stranger moved with the easy, confident stride of a man accustomed to long days in the saddle. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but something in his posture suggested he wasn't one to ignore a woman in distress. "Mister," the stranger called, his voice calm but carrying the undercurrent of steel that made Frank's head snap up. "I believe the ladies had enough of your conversation." Frank's grip tightened painfully. "Mind your own business, Drifter. This is between me and my wife." The stranger stopped a few paces away, pushing his hat back to reveal piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. When a man puts his hands on a woman in the street, it becomes everybody's business. He stood relaxed, but Willa noticed his right hand rested casually near the pistol at his hip. "The name's Jake Turner," the stranger continued. "Just rode in from Silver City. Now I'm asking politely let the lady go." "This is my wife," Frank spat, but Willa could feel his grip loosening slightly. Jake Turner's gaze shifted to Willa, taking in the reddening mark on her cheek and the fear in her eyes. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, of a situation he'd seen before. "Madam," he said gently, "are you all right?" Before Willa could respond, Frank shoved her roughly behind him. "She's fine. Just needs to learn her place." Jake's expression hardened. "Seems to me the one who needs to learn his place is you." He took a step forward. "Where I come from, men who hit women aren't considered men at all." Frank's face flushed an ugly red. "You threatening me, cowboy?" "Just stating a fact." Jake's voice remained level. "Now I'm going to say this one more time. Take your hands off her and walk away. Cool your head." Something in Jake's steady gaze must have penetrated Frank's alcohol-fueled bravado. He released Willa's arm with a shove. "This ain't over," he muttered, but he backed away and stalked toward the saloon, throwing one last venomous glance over his shoulder. Willa stood trembling, one hand absently rubbing her arm where Frank's fingers had dug in. She was acutely aware of the whispers from the onlookers, the pitying glances that made her want to disappear into the hard-packed dirt beneath her feet. Jake Turner approached her carefully, as one might a skittish horse. "Madam, can I help you with your packages?" Willa shook her head quickly. "No, thank you, Mr. Turner. You've done enough. If Frank sees you helping me." She left the thought unfinished, understanding crossed Jake's face. "At least let me walk you to wherever you're headed, just to be sure." She hesitated, knowing that accepting his offer would only fuel Frank's rage later, but something in Jake's steady presence made her nod. "I was just going to the general store." They walked in silence for a moment, the eyes of the town following them. "You're not from around here," Willa said finally, desperate to fill the uncomfortable quiet. "No, madam. Been working cattle drives up from Texas. Thought I might settle for a spell, see if there's honest work to be had." "Hillsboro's a mining town mostly," she replied, keeping her eyes on the dusty street ahead. "Silver, some gold. The ranches are farther out," Jake nodded. "I figured as much. Doesn't matter much to me what the work is, long as it's honest." They reached the general store, and Willa paused at the steps. "Thank you, Mr. Turner, but I should go in alone." Her eyes darted nervously toward the saloon where Frank had disappeared. Jake seemed to understand. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins, just—" He hesitated. "Just know that not all men are like your husband." For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and Willa felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a flicker of hope. Then she lowered her gaze and hurried into the store, the bell above the door announcing her entrance. Behind the counter, old Mr. Pritchard looked up from his ledger. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying a hint of pity that made her cheeks burn with shame. "What can I help you with today?" "Just some flour and sugar, please," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "And thread. Blue, if you have it." As Mr. Pritchard gathered her items, she glanced out the window to see Jake Turner still standing outside, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He wasn't looking her way, but his presence was a silent promise of protection that brought an unfamiliar lump to her throat. She paid for her purchases with the meager coins Frank allowed her and stepped back onto the boardwalk. Jake tipped his hat to her, but maintained a respectful distance. "Will you be all right getting home, Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked. Willa nodded. "Our place is just at the edge of town. I'll be fine, truly." Jake looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he simply nodded. "Good day then, madam." She watched him walk away, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound with each step. Only when he disappeared around the corner did she start the long walk home, dreading what awaited her there. The Jenkins home was a small, weathered structure at the eastern edge of Hillsboro. Once painted white, the clapboards had faded to a dull gray that seemed to reflect the life within. Willa pushed open the front door, wincing at the squeal of rusty hinges. The house was quiet. Frank wouldn't be home for hours, not until the saloon closed or he ran out of money. She set her packages on the kitchen table and went to the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The mark on her cheek was reddening into what would likely be a bruise by morning. She touched it gently, tears welling in her eyes. This wasn't the life she had imagined when she'd married Frank Jenkins 6 years ago. He'd been charming then, full of promises about the life they would build together. The drinking had started after the mine accident that left him with a permanent limp and a perpetual chip on his shoulder. The first time he'd hit her had been 2 years ago. She dropped a plate, and the sound had triggered something dark in him. She'd told herself it wouldn't happen again. Then she'd told herself she deserved it. Now she simply endured, too afraid and too ashamed to leave. Willa went about preparing supper, her movements mechanical. As she worked, her mind kept returning to Jake Turner's kind eyes and the way he'd stood up to Frank without hesitation. Men like that were rare in her experience. She was just setting the stew to simmer when the door crashed open. Frank stumbled in, reeking of whiskey, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Where is he?" he demanded, lurching toward her. Willa backed away, her hands raised defensively. "Who?" "That cowboy," Frank spat. "The one who thought he could tell me how to handle my wife." "I don't know," Willa said, her voice trembling. "I haven't seen him since town." Frank grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully. "Don't lie to me. Jenkins at the saloon said he saw you two talking outside the store." "He just asked if I needed help with my packages," Willa gasped. "That's all, Frank, I swear." His open hand connected with her cheek, the same spot he'd struck earlier. Stars exploded behind her eyes as she stumbled backward, colliding with the stove. The pot of stew teetered dangerously but didn't fall. "You think I don't see the way men look at you?" Frank snarled, advancing on her again. You encourage them, batting your eyes, smiling pretty. No, Willa sobbed. I don't, Frank, please. His fist came this time, catching her temple. She crumpled to the floor, ears ringing, vision blurring. Frank stood over her, chest heaving. You're my wife, he said, his voice suddenly quiet and all the more terrifying for it. Mine. You remember that. He turned and stomped out of the house, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Willa lay on the floor, waiting until the sound of his uneven footsteps faded before she allowed herself to move. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself up, using the edge of the table for support. Her head throbbed, and when she touched her temple, her fingers came away wet with blood. This was the worst it had ever been. Something had changed today, the public confrontation, the stranger who dared to intervene. Frank's pride was wounded, and he'd taken it out on her as she'd known he would. Willa stumbled to the water bucket and dipped a cloth, pressing it to her temple. The cool water helped clear her head, and with clarity came a realization. If she stayed, one day Frank would kill her. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange calm. She had to leave. Tonight. She moved quickly then, grabbing a small carpet bag from under the bed. Into it went her spare dress, a shawl, the cameo brooch that had been her mother's, and the small pouch of coins she'd managed to hide away over the years, pennies and nickels saved from household money. Never enough to really escape, but perhaps enough to get her to the next town. Willa had no idea where she would go or what she would do. She had no family left, no friends close enough to shelter her. But anything was better than waiting for Frank's rage to consume them both. Night had fallen by the time she finished packing. She tied her bonnet firmly under her chin, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and picked up the carpet bag. At the door, she paused, looking back at the small house that had been both home and prison for the past 6 years. Then she stepped out into the darkness, closing the door softly behind her. Hillsborough was quiet at this hour. Most respectable folk were home with their families, while those seeking less wholesome entertainment were concentrated around the saloon at the other end of town. Willa kept to the shadows, moving quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. The stagecoach wouldn't come through until tomorrow afternoon. She needed a place to hide until then. She was so focused on avoiding being seen that she didn't notice the figure stepping out of an alley until she collided with him. A strong hand steadied her, and Willa looked up into the face of Jake Turner. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Then his eyes narrowed as he took in her face in the dim light from a nearby window. "My God, what did he do to you?" Willa touched her temple self-consciously. In her haste, she hadn't thought to cover the marks. "It's nothing," she said automatically, then shook her head. "No, that's not true." "It's everything. I'm leaving, tonight." Jake's expression was grim. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," she admitted. "The next town, maybe, somewhere he won't find me." He was silent for a moment, then said, "I have a room at the boarding house. You should clean up that cut properly. Then we can figure out what to do." Alarm flashed through her. "I couldn't possibly. You'll take the bed," Jake interrupted firmly. "I'll sleep in the chair. Mrs. Harding runs a respectable house and she'll be there. You'll be safe, I promise." Willa hesitated. Going to a man's room, even under these circumstances, went against everything she'd been taught. But her options were few, and the idea of a safe place to rest, even for a few hours, was tempting. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Jake led her to a small boarding house on a side street. The proprietress, Mrs. Harding, was a plump, no-nonsense woman who took one look at Willa's face and ushered her inside without question. "Poor dear," she clucked, settling Willa in a chair in the kitchen while she heated water. "I've seen your husband around town. Never liked the look of him." She cast a sidelong glance at Jake, who hovered in the doorway. This one's better. Known him just a day, but I can tell." "It's not like that," Willa protested weakly. Mrs. Harding just hummed non-committally and began cleaning Willa's cut with gentle efficiency. "This'll need a stitch or two," she said. "Lucky for you, I was a midwife back east. Learned a thing or two about patching people up." Jake excused himself while Mrs. Harding worked, returning only when the older woman called him back. Willa's temple now sported 2 neat stitches, and Mrs. Harding had provided her with a cup of strong tea liberally laced with whiskey. "She can stay in your room tonight," Mrs. Harding told Jake. "I'll be right across the hall if she needs anything. And you," she fixed him with a stern look, "will sleep down here on the settee." Jake raised his hands in surrender. "Yes, madam, that was always the plan." Mrs. Harding nodded approvingly. "Good. Now Mrs. Jenkins needs rest. We can sort out the rest in the morning." Willa followed the older woman upstairs, casting a grateful glance back at Jake. In the small, clean room, Mrs. Harding helped her out of her dress and into a borrowed nightgown. "That man of yours," Mrs. Harding said as she turned down the bed, "he's going to be looking for you come morning." "I know," Willa whispered. "Well, you just rest easy tonight. Between me and Mr. Turner downstairs, no one's going to bother you." She patted Willa's hand. "Sleep now. Things often look clearer in the light of day." Left alone, Willa sank onto the bed, her body suddenly aware of every ache and pain. The events of the day washed over her in waves: Frank's public humiliation of her, Jake's unexpected intervention, the brutal beating, her desperate flight. Tears came then, silent and hot, until exhaustion finally claimed her and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came too soon. Willa woke to sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the smell of coffee wafting up from downstairs. For a moment she was disoriented, then memory flooded back. She was in Jake Turner's room at Mrs. Harding's boarding house. She had left Frank. She was free and in terrible danger. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, wincing as she raised her arms. Her body was a map of bruises, old and new. In the small mirror above the washstand, she examined her face. The cut at her temple was neat, the stitches nearly invisible, but the surrounding area was discolored and swollen. No amount of careful styling would hide it. Downstairs, she found Jake and Mrs. Harding in the kitchen. They broke off their conversation when she entered, and Willa knew they had been discussing her. "Good morning," Mrs. Harding said brightly, setting a cup of coffee before her. "Feeling better after some rest?" "Yes, thank you," Willa said, though in truth she felt like her bones had turned to lead overnight. Jake studied her face, his expression darkening at the sight of her bruises in the clear morning light. "We were just talking about getting you out of Hillsborough," he said without preamble. "The stage doesn't come through until this afternoon. And your husband's already been by the saloon this morning, asking if anyone's seen you," Mrs. Harding added grimly. "It won't be long before he thinks to look here." Willa's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door, Mrs. Harding." "Nonsense," the older woman sniffed. "I've been looking for a reason to give Frank Jenkins a piece of my mind for years." "Still," Jake said, "it would be better if we got you somewhere safer until the stage arrives." "Where?" Willa asked. Hillsborough was small, barely more than a main street with a few side alleys. There weren't many places to hide. "I've been thinking about that," Jake said. "There's an abandoned line shack about 2 miles north of town. Used to belong to the Silver Creek outfit before they went bust. It's not much, but it's isolated and defensible." "Defensible?" Willa echoed, a chill running through her. Jake met her gaze steadily. "Your husband struck you in public yesterday, Mrs. Jenkins. He beat you bloody in your own home. I don't think he's going to let you walk away without a fight." The stark truth of his words hung in the air between them. Willa had known, of course, that Frank would be angry when he discovered she was gone, but hearing Jake lay it out so plainly made it real in a way her own thoughts hadn't. "I can't ask you to risk yourself for me," she said finally. "This is my problem. With all due respect, madam, it became my problem when I stepped between you and your husband yesterday." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. "I don't make a habit of starting something I'm not willing to finish." Mrs. Harding cleared her throat. "Well, that's settled then. I'll pack you some food for the day, and Mr. Turner can get you safely to the line shack. I'll come by with word once the stage is due." An hour later, Willa found herself riding behind Jake Turner on his sturdy bay gelding. Mrs. Harding had provided her with a faded calico dress and a wide-brimmed hat that helped conceal her face. They had left town by a back trail, avoiding the main street where Frank might be looking for her. The line shack came into view as they crested a small rise, a weathered structure nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, a small creek gurgling nearby. It looked abandoned, as Jake had said, but solid enough. "It's not much," Jake said as he helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "But it should keep us out of sight until the stage comes." Inside, the shack was dusty but intact. A rough table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot were the only furniture. Jake set about clearing cobwebs and opening the single window to let in fresh air, while Willa unpacked the food Mrs. Harding had provided. "Have you decided where you'll go?" Jake asked as they sat down to a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. Willa shook her head. "I have a cousin in Denver. We haven't spoken in years, but she might take me in, at least until I can find work." "What kind of work do you do?" "Before I married Frank, I was a teacher in a small school back in Kansas." The memory felt like it belonged to someone else, a young woman with dreams and confidence, not the bruised and fearful creature she had become. Jake nodded. "Denver's growing fast. They probably need teachers." "Maybe," Willa said, though the idea of standing in front of a classroom again seemed as distant as the moon. "What about you? You said you were looking for work in Hillsborough." "Nothing holding me there now," Jake said with a shrug. "Might move on myself." They fell into an easy silence then, the kind that forms between people who have shared an intense experience. Willa found herself studying Jake's face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun, the small scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the way his mouth curved up slightly at one corner even in repose. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "Yesterday in town." "You didn't know me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the line shack. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Her husband was like yours. By the time I found out how bad it was too late." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. "I'm sorry," Willa said softly. Jake nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "When I saw your husband grab you like that in the street, it was like seeing the past all over again. I couldn't walk away." "Thank you," Willa whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "Not just for yesterday, for today, for everything." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, connection, the recognition of shared pain. Then Jake stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "I should check on the horse," he said, moving to the door. "Keep away from the window, just in case." Willa watched him go, her hand still warm from where it had touched his. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, not quite hope, but something close to it. The possibility of a future without fear. Outside, Jake took his time checking the horse, using the task to clear his head. He'd meant what he said about his sister, though he hadn't told Willa the whole story, how he'd found Sarah after her husband had beaten her to death, how he'd tracked the man for 3 states, before finally catching up to him in a dingy saloon in Oklahoma Territory. The law called it murder. Jake called it justice. He hadn't planned on staying in Hillsborough long. It was just another stop on a restless journey that had no real destination. But when he'd seen Frank Jenkins manhandling his wife in the street, something had shifted inside him. The woman's quiet dignity in the face of her husband's cruelty had stirred something protective in Jake that he thought had died with his sister. Now, looking back at the line shack where Willa Jenkins waited, Jake knew his plans had changed. He couldn't leave her to face her future alone, not when Frank was still out there, angry and vengeful. The stage would take her away today, but that wouldn't be the end of it. Men like Frank Jenkins didn't give up what they considered theirs. Jake led the horse to a small corral attached to the line shack and removed the saddle, giving the animal a chance to rest. As he worked, he kept a careful eye on the trail they had followed. Frank might be searching the town still, but it wouldn't take him long to start looking farther afield. Inside, Willa tried to occupy herself by tidying the already sparse shack. Her hands needed something to do, or else they would tremble uncontrollably. The waiting was the worst part, knowing that somewhere out there, Frank was looking for her, his rage building with every passing hour. She had never seen herself as brave. Even leaving last night had been born of desperation rather than courage. But now, in the quiet of the abandoned line shack, she found herself thinking about the future in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. If she made it to Denver, she could start over. She was 24, still young enough to rebuild a life. She could teach again, perhaps, or find other respectable work. The bruises would fade. The fear might take longer, but she was determined to reclaim the woman she had been before Frank Jenkins had broken her down piece by piece. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered her reverie. Willa froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It was too early for Mrs. Harding to bring news about the stagecoach. She moved to the window, staying to one side as Jake had instructed, and peered out cautiously. Jake was already moving toward the approaching rider, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Relief flooded through Willa as she recognized Mrs. Harding's buggy. The older woman pulled to a stop, her face grave as she spoke to Jake. Willa couldn't hear what they were saying, but the urgency in their gestures told her everything she needed to know. She grabbed her carpetbag and stepped outside just as Jake turned toward the shack. "Frank's gone to the sheriff," Mrs. Harding called to her, not bothering to dismount from her buggy. "Saying you've been kidnapped by a drifter." "That's ridiculous," Willa protested. "I left of my own free will." "Sheriff Wilson knows that," Jake said grimly, "but he's obligated to investigate." And Frank's gathered a few of his drinking buddies. They're forming a search party. Willa's blood ran cold. "They'll come here." "Eventually," Jake agreed, "which is why we need to move now. The stage won't reach Hillsborough for another 3 hours and we can't wait here." "Where can we go?" Willa asked, panic rising in her throat. Jake was already saddling his horse with quick, efficient movements. "There's another route to Carlton, the next town south. It's rougher terrain, but the stage passes through there after Hillsborough. If we ride hard, we can beat it there." Mrs. Harding climbed down from her buggy, her expression worried. "Frank was in a state when I saw him, Mrs. Jenkins. More dangerous than usual. You need to get as far away from Hillsborough as possible." "What about you?" Willa asked. "He'll know you helped me." The older woman snorted. "Let him try something. Half the town's seen what he does to you. They might not have had the courage to step in, but they won't stand for him threatening a respectable widow woman." Jake finished with the horse and turned to Willa. "We need to go. Now." Willa embraced Mrs. Harding quickly. "Thank you for everything." "You just take care of yourself," the older woman replied, patting her back. "And keep this one close," she added, nodding toward Jake. "He's a good man." Moments later, Willa was once again on horseback behind Jake, her arms wrapped around his waist as they galloped south toward Carlton. The terrain was indeed rougher than the main road, a narrow trail winding through scrubby hills and dry arroyos. Jake pushed his horse hard, knowing they needed every minute of lead time they could get. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Jake suddenly pulled the horse to a halt, listening intently. Willa heard it too, the distant sound of multiple horses approaching from behind. "They found our trail faster than I expected," Jake muttered. He scanned the surrounding landscape, looking for options. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow gap between two rocky outcroppings. "We need to get off this trail." He urged the horse forward, navigating the increasingly difficult terrain. The gap led to a small box canyon, its walls steep but not unclimbable. At the far end, a trickle of water fed a small pool surrounded by scrubby vegetation. "We'll leave the horse here," Jake decided, helping Willa dismount. "The walls will hide us and they might ride past." "What if they don't?" Willa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake checked his pistol, his expression grim. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes." They led the horse to the pool, letting it drink while they listened anxiously for sounds of pursuit. The distant hoofbeats grew louder, then suddenly stopped. "They've reached where we left the trail," Jake said, drawing Willa deeper into the canyon, toward a cluster of boulders that offered some cover. "Stay low." Willa crouched behind the largest boulder, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give away their position. Jake positioned himself slightly ahead of her, his body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Voices drifted to them on the hot, still air, indistinct at first, then clearer as the searchers moved closer to the canyon entrance. "Tracks lead this way," a voice said. Willa recognized it as Bill Peterson, one of Frank's regular drinking companions. "Could be just some wild horses," another man argued. "We're wasting time. They're probably headed straight for Carlton." "Frank said to check every trail, every canyon," Peterson insisted. "That drifter's got his wife, and he means to have her back." "Or what's left of her," someone muttered, followed by a few chuckles that made Willa's skin crawl. Jake's hand tightened on his pistol, his knuckles white. Willa touched his arm gently, silently pleading with him not to reveal their position. They were outnumbered, and a shootout would only end badly. The sound of horses entering the canyon made them both freeze. Willa held her breath, pressing herself as flat against the boulder as possible. Jake shifted slightly, getting a better line of sight while staying concealed. "Nothing here but some old horse tracks," one of the men called. "Probably that wild herd that roams these parts." "Let's check the back of the canyon anyway," Peterson replied. "Frank's offering good money to whoever finds them first." Hoofbeats approached their hiding place. Willa closed her eyes, sending up a silent prayer. Beside her, Jake tensed, ready to spring into action if discovered. The horses were almost upon them when a shout came from the canyon entrance. "Riders coming up the main trail. Could be them." The approaching horses wheeled abruptly. "Let's go," Peterson called. "Quick, before they get away." The sound of galloping hooves receded as the search party raced back out of the canyon. Willa let out the breath she'd been holding, her entire body trembling with relief. "That was too close," Jake said, his voice low. "But it gives us a chance. They'll be focused on the main trail for a while. We can circle back toward Carlton using the high country." "Who do you think they saw on the trail?" Willa asked as they retrieved their horse. "Probably just travelers," Jake replied. "But it bought us time, and right now that's what we need most." They set out again, this time taking an even more circuitous route that kept them well away from the main trails. The sun beat down mercilessly, as they picked their way through rocky terrain that seemed to have never felt a human footstep. Jake's horse was beginning to show signs of fatigue, forced to carry double its usual load over difficult ground. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a ridge overlooking Carlton. The small settlement was even more modest than Hillsborough, just a cluster of buildings around a stagecoach stop. But to Willa, it represented safety, a chance to escape Frank's reach once and for all. "The stage should be arriving within the hour," Jake said, studying the town below. "I don't see any sign of Frank or his men." "We made it," Willa breathed, hardly daring to believe their ordeal might be nearly over. Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Not quite yet. We need to get you on that stage without being seen. Frank might have sent someone ahead to watch the station." They descended carefully, approaching Carlton from the north, away from the main road. Jake led them to a small stand of trees on the outskirts of town. "Wait here," he told Willa. "I'll go check the situation at the stage stop." "Be careful," she said, reluctant to let him go. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "Always am." Willa watched anxiously as he walked into town, his gait casual, just another drifter passing through. The minutes stretched interminably as she waited among the trees, jumping at every sound. Her future hung in the balance, freedom just within reach, but still not certain. Jake returned nearly half an hour later, his expression grim. "Frank's here," he said without preamble. "He and 2 others are watching the stage stop. They must have guessed our plan." Willa's hope crumbled. "What do we do now?" Jake was silent for a moment, thinking. "The stage will stop for 20 minutes to change horses. That's our window. I'll create a distraction, something to draw Frank and his men away from the station. You'll have to move fast when I give the signal." "What kind of distraction?" Willa asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Better you don't know the details," Jake replied, avoiding her gaze. "Just be ready to run for the stage when you hear the commotion." Willa caught his arm. "Jake, please don't do anything foolish. Frank is dangerous when he's angry." Jake covered her hand with his touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "I've handled worse than Frank Jenkins." The distant sound of the stagecoach's approach interrupted their conversation. Jake straightened, his expression resolute. "It's time. Stay here until you hear the distraction, then make for the stage. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" Willa asked, suddenly reluctant to leave him behind. "I'll be right behind you," Jake promised, though something in his eyes made Willa doubt his words. "Now stay low and wait for my signal." Before she could protest further, he was gone, moving swiftly toward the town. Willa crouched in the shelter of the trees, her carpetbag clutched tightly to her chest, waiting and watching as the stagecoach rolled into Carlton in a cloud of dust. From her vantage point, she could see Frank and his companions positioned near the stage stop, their attention focused on the arriving coach. Frank looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes disheveled, his face set in lines of rage. The sight of him made Willa's stomach clench with fear, but also strengthened her resolve. She would not go back to him, not ever. The stage pulled to a stop, and passengers began to disembark, stretching their legs after the long, jolting journey from the north. Fresh horses were led out to replace the tired team. Everything proceeded with the efficient routine of a regular stop. Willa tensed, waiting for Jake's distraction. What was he planning? The minutes ticked by and still nothing happened. The fresh horses were almost hitched, passengers beginning to climb back aboard. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Then it happened, not with a bang, but with a shout. "Fire! Fire at the saloon!" Heads turned as smoke began to billow from the small building at the far end of the street. People ran toward it, shouting for water buckets. Frank and one of his companions hesitated, torn between their watch and the commotion. Go check it out, Frank ordered his companion, who hurried toward the smoke. We'll stay here. It wasn't the complete distraction they'd hoped for. Frank and one man remained vigilant at the stage stop, their eyes scanning every approaching figure. Willa's heart sank. The stage driver was calling for final boarding. It was now or never. Then she saw Jake approaching from behind Frank, moving with quiet purpose. Before she could process what was happening, Jake had drawn his pistol and brought it down hard on the back of Frank's companion's head. The man crumpled without a sound. Frank whirled, reaching for his own gun, but Jake was faster. He slammed his fist into Frank's face, sending him staggering backward. Now, Willa, Jake shouted. Run! Willa burst from her hiding place, running toward the stage with every ounce of strength she possessed. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of struggle grunts, the thud of fists on flesh, a cry of pain. She reached the stage just as the driver was climbing up to his seat. Wait, she gasped. Please, I need passage to Denver. The driver looked down at her battered face, then at the fight occurring just yards away. Understanding dawned in his weathered features. Get in, madam, quickly now. Willa scrambled into the coach, collapsing onto an empty seat across from an elderly couple who regarded her with startled curiosity. Through the window, she saw Frank and Jake locked in vicious combat, rolling in the dust of the street. Blood streaked both their faces. Please, she called to the driver. My friend can't wait, madam, the driver said grimly. Schedule to keep. He cracked his whip and the fresh team lunged forward. The stage lurched into motion just as Frank got the upper hand, pinning Jake to the ground. Willa pressed her face to the window, watching helplessly as the two men grew smaller with distance. Then, incredibly, Jake broke free, delivering a powerful blow that sent Frank sprawling. As the stage rounded a bend, the last thing Willa saw was Jake Turner standing over her husband, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. The elderly woman seated across from Willa leaned forward, concern etched on her kind face. Are you all right, dear? You look like you've been through quite an ordeal. Willa touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. Yes, she said softly, but I think the worst is behind me now. As the stagecoach rumbled on toward the next stop, Willa found herself torn between relief at her escape and worry for the man who had made it possible. Jake Turner had risked everything for her, a woman he barely knew, and now she might never see him again. She closed her eyes, the gentle swaying of the coach lulling her into an exhausted doze. Her last conscious thought was of Jake's face, not as she had last seen it, bloodied and fierce in combat, but as it had been in quiet moments, kind eyes watching her with a respect she had almost forgotten she deserved. Back in Carlton, Jake Turner stood over Frank Jenkins, his chest heaving from exertion. The fight had been brutal but brief. Frank's rage no match for Jake's controlled skill. Now Frank lay unconscious in the dirt, blood trickling from his nose and a split lip. You should kill him, said a voice behind Jake. He turned to find one of the townspeople, a grizzled old-timer with a shotgun propped on his shoulder, watching the scene with detached interest. No, Jake said, wiping blood from his own cut cheek. That's not my right. He'll come after you, the old man warned. Men like that don't forget. Let him try. Jake checked to make sure Frank was still breathing, then looked up at the dissipating smoke from the saloon. The fire had been nothing more than some damp hay tossed into the stove, enough to create smoke but no real danger. Stage is gone, the old-timer commented. Your lady friend with it, I reckon. Jake nodded, relief washing through him. Willa was safe, at least for now. That was the plan. Sheriff's going to have questions when he gets back from Hillsborough. I'll be gone before then, Jake replied, already moving toward where he'd left his horse. The old man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heading after her, are you?" Jake paused, considering the question. He hadn't thought beyond getting Willa safely away from Frank. Now, with that accomplished, he found himself at a crossroads. He could continue his aimless wandering, or maybe, he said finally, got some business to attend to first. The old-timer cackled. "Well, when you catch up to her, tell her Martha says she's better off without that sorry excuse for a husband." Jake's lips quirked into a half-smile. "I'll do that." He retrieved his horse from where he'd left it and rode out of Carlton without looking back. But instead of following the stagecoach route toward Denver, he turned south, toward the New Mexico Territorial Court in Las Cruces. Frank Jenkins might not face justice for what he'd done to his wife, but Jake intended to make sure he never had the chance to hurt her again. 2 days later, in a Denver boarding house, Willa Jenkins sat by the window, watching the busy street below. Her cousin Harriet had welcomed her with open arms, horrified by the bruises that even now were only beginning to fade. The safety and comfort of her cousin's home was a balm to Willa's battered spirit, but she found her thoughts constantly drifting back to Carlton, to Jake Turner, and the sacrifice he had made for her. "You're thinking about him again," Harriet observed, setting a cup of tea beside Willa. Willa smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious? You get a certain look," Harriet replied, sitting opposite her. "This cowboy of yours must be quite something." "He's not my cowboy," Willa protested, though the words lacked conviction. "He's just a good man who helped me when I needed it most." Harriet hummed noncommittally. "Well, good men are rare enough that when one crosses your path, you'd be wise to keep him in sight." Willa sipped her tea, her mind filled with memories of Jake's steady presence, his quiet strength. "I don't even know if he's alive," she admitted softly. Frank was very angry. Harriet reached across to squeeze her hand. "Have faith, cousin. The kind of man who would stand between you and harm's way doesn't fall easily." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Harriet rose to answer it, returning a moment later with a telegram in hand. "For you," she said, extending it to Willa with a curious expression. Willa took the paper with trembling fingers. She had given no one this address except her cousin. Who could possibly know she was here? The message was brief, just a few lines. Frank Jenkins arrested for assault and attempted murder. Territorial court holding him without bail. You are safe. Will arrive Denver Friday if welcome. JT. The paper shook in Willa's hands as tears of relief and joy welled in her eyes. Jake was alive. Frank was in custody, and Jake was coming to Denver if she welcomed it. Harriet, reading over her shoulder, let out a delighted laugh. Well, it seems your cowboy is quite resourceful." "He's coming here," Willa whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Friday," Harriet confirmed. "That's tomorrow." She studied her cousin's face. "Are you going to see him?" Willa clutched the telegram to her chest, her heart racing with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since she'd fled Hillsborough. "Yes, I am." The following afternoon found Willa waiting nervously at the Denver stagecoach depot. Harriet had helped her select a new dress, a modest blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and had arranged her hair in a becoming style that also served to partially conceal the fading bruises on her face. "You look lovely," Harriet had assured her before she left. "And more importantly, you look like yourself again, not his shadow." Now, as the incoming stage from the south rolled into the depot in a cloud of dust, Willa felt her courage faltering. What if Jake had changed his mind? What if he had come to Denver on other business entirely? What if he took one look at her and decided she wasn't worth the trouble he'd gone through? Passengers began to disembark, stretching and gathering their belongings after the long, uncomfortable journey. Willa scanned each face anxiously, her heart sinking as the coach emptied without any sign of Jake. Then a tall figure descended from the far side of the coach, and Willa's breath caught in her throat. Jake Turner looked tired and travel-worn, with a healing cut on his cheekbone and a fading bruise along his jaw, souvenirs of his fight with Frank. But his eyes were the same clear and kind as they searched the crowd. When those eyes found her, the smile that spread across his face made Willa's heart skip a beat. He moved toward her with long, purposeful strides, stopping just short of where she stood. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, removing his hat. "You're looking well." "Mr. Turner," she replied, suddenly shy. "I'm glad to see you recovered from your encounter with Frank." Jake's smile turned rueful as he touched the cut on his cheek. This had worse shaving. His expression grew serious. "Frank won't bother you again, Willa. I made sure of it." "Your telegram said he was arrested," she said. "How did you manage that?" "Turns out the sheriff in Carlton witnessed most of our altercation, and when several townspeople came forward to describe Frank's behavior and your condition." Jake shrugged. "The territorial judge was convinced Frank was a danger to you and others. He'll be imprisoned for quite some time." Relief washed over Willa, leaving her knees weak. "I can hardly believe it's over." "It is," Jake assured her. "You're free now, free to build whatever life you choose." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Willa saw her future unfolding with startling clarity. This man, who had risked everything for a woman he barely knew, who had pursued justice on her behalf, without expectation of reward, this was a man unlike any she had known before. "I received your telegram," she said softly. "You said you would come if you were welcome." Jake nodded, his expression suddenly uncertain. "I didn't want to presume." "You are welcome, Jake," Willa said, finding courage in his vulnerability. "Very welcome indeed." The smile that lit his face then was like the dawn breaking after the longest night. "I was hoping you'd say that." In the weeks that followed, Willa and Jake created a rhythm to their days that felt both new and strangely familiar, as if they had known each other far longer than the tumultuous circumstances of their meeting would suggest. Jake found work at a livery stable, while Willa secured a position as a teacher's assistant at a local school, her confidence growing daily as she rediscovered the woman she had been, before Frank Jenkins had systematically broken her down. They took things slowly, both aware of the shadows Willa's marriage had cast over her ability to trust. Jake never pushed, never presumed, his patience as steady as his presence in her life. Harriet watched their careful courtship with approval, though she occasionally made pointed comments about the advantages of getting on with things. "Life is uncertain and often too short," she told Willa one evening after Jake had escorted her home from a concert in the park. "When happiness presents itself, one should grab it with both hands." Willa smiled, touching the small bouquet of wildflowers Jake had presented her with earlier. "We're taking our time, Harriet. There's no rush." "HMPH," her cousin snorted. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. And don't think I haven't noticed how you watch him when you think no one's looking." Heat crept into Willa's cheeks. "It's complicated." "Only because you're making it so," Harriet countered. "Frank Jenkins stole years of your life, Willa. Don't give him power over your future as well." The word stayed with Willa long after she retired for the night. Was she allowing her fear of making another mistake to hold her back from happiness? Jake Turner was nothing like Frank. His strength was tempered with kindness, his confidence never crossing into arrogance. In the time she had known him, she had never seen him raise his voice in anger, let alone his hand. The next day was Saturday, and Jake had promised to take her on a picnic in the foothills outside Denver. He arrived promptly at noon, his horse and a rented mare hitched to a small buggy. "You look beautiful," he said as he helped her up, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. Willa smiled, feeling truly beautiful for the first time in years. The bruises had faded completely now, and regular meals had filled out the gauntness that had marked her features when she'd first arrived in Denver. "Thank you," she said. "It's a lovely day for a picnic." They drove out of the city, following a winding road into the foothills where aspen trees were just beginning to show hints of gold among their green leaves. Jake found a secluded spot near a bubbling stream, spreading a blanket beneath the dappled shade of a large cottonwood. They ate the simple meal Willa had prepared: fried chicken, cornbread, and apple tarts, talking easily about their week, the changing seasons, the growth of Denver. It was only when they had finished eating that Jake's manner changed, becoming slightly nervous in a way Willa had never seen before. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Something I've been carrying for a while now." He handed her a small velvet pouch. Willa opened it curiously, tipping the contents into her palm. A gold band set with a small but perfect diamond glinted in the sunlight, alongside an official-looking document. "Jake," she breathed, hardly daring to understand what this meant. "The ring was my mother's," he said quickly. "The other is. Well, it's the final divorce decree from the territorial court. Frank didn't contest it given his current circumstances. You're legally free, Willa." She stared at the document, emotions washing over her in waves. Free. Truly, officially free from the man who had made her life a living hell. "I know it might be too soon," Jake continued, his words coming faster now. "And if it is, I understand. I'll wait as long as you need. But I want you to know that I love you, Willa. Have since that first day in Hillsborough when you stood there with your head held high despite everything." Tears blurred Willa's vision as she looked up at him. "Jake, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Just think about it, about us." Willa closed her hand around the ring, feeling its solid weight so different from the crushing burden she had carried for so long. "I don't need to think about it," she said softly. "I love you too, Jake, and yes, I will marry you." The joy that transformed Jake's face was like nothing Willa had ever seen. He gathered her in his arms gently, as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and kissed her with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Jake took the ring from her palm and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. "I promise you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this decision." Willa touched his face, tracing the faint scar left by his fight with Frank. "I already know I won't." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Harriet's parlor, with a handful of friends they had made in Denver as witnesses. Willa wore a cream-colored dress that Harriet insisted on purchasing for the occasion, and Jake looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit that he clearly found slightly constraining, but wore with good grace for her sake. As they spoke their vows, Willa marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. Just months ago, she had been trapped in a nightmare, believing there was no escape. Now she stood beside a man who had not only rescued her from that darkness, but had shown her that she possessed the strength to rescue herself as well. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Jake's kiss was gentle, but held a promise of passion that made Willa's cheeks flush. The small gathering applauded, Harriet wiping away uncharacteristic tears. Later, as they prepared to leave for the small house Jake had rented on the outskirts of Denver, Harriet pulled Willa aside for a private word. "I am so very happy for you, cousin," she said, embracing Willa tightly. "Your Jake is everything Frank was not and everything you deserve." "Thank you," Willa whispered, for taking me in when I had nowhere else to go." Harriet waved away her gratitude. "Family helps family, always have, always will." She glanced over at Jake, who was loading their few belongings into the buggy. "Though I expect you'll be creating your own family soon enough," she added with a knowing smile. Willa blushed, but didn't deny it. The thought of having children with Jake, children raised in a home, filled with love and respect, filled her with joy, rather than the dread such thoughts had evoked during her first marriage. Their new home was modest but comfortable, a small house with a garden out back and room for Jake to keep a few horses. Denver was growing rapidly, and Jake's skill with horses ensured he was never short of work. Willa continued teaching, finding fulfillment in helping young minds grow. As the months passed, they settled into the rhythms of married life with an ease that sometimes amazed Willa. There were adjustments, of course, moments when an unexpected movement made her flinch, memories that surfaced in the dark of night, but Jake's patience never wavered. He held her when the nightmares came, listened when she needed to talk, and gave her space when silence was what she craved. And in time, the scars, both visible and invisible, began to fade. Willa learned to trust again, to laugh freely, to love without fear. The woman who had fled Hillsborough in terror was becoming a distant memory, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more alive. One evening, as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink, Willa rested her head on Jake's shoulder, a contentment she had once thought impossible filling her heart. "I never thanked you properly," she said softly. Jake's arm tightened around her. "For what?" "For seeing me that day in Hillsborough, really seeing me when I had become invisible to everyone else." Jake was quiet for a moment, his hand gently stroking her arm. "I think you had it backward," he said finally. "I was the invisible one, just drifting, no purpose, no place to call home. Then I saw you, and suddenly everything came into focus." Willa turned her face up to his, overwhelmed by the love she saw in his eyes. "We saved each other then." "I reckon we did," Jake agreed, bending to kiss her softly. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their small piece of the world, Willa Jenkins Turner knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in the arms of a man who had taught her what real love looked like. And in the years that followed, through the birth of their children, through the growth of the city around them, through all the joys and challenges that life brought their way, that certainty never wavered. The wounds of her past had healed, leaving scars that reminded her of her strength rather than her suffering. Frank Jenkins remained a distant memory, his power over her long since broken. And Jake Turner, the cowboy who had once stepped between her and harm's way, remained by her side, his love a constant reminder that some endings are really beginnings in disguise.